grandchildren. Gotta try to save this country.
Have you ever wondered what happens when a city tries to put on a fresh coat of paint for flashy events like the 2026 World Cup, but totally forgets to look out for the people literally sleeping on its sidewalks? Honestly, looking at major hubs like San Francisco or LA right now, everything seems pretty glitzy on the surface. But you only have to step just a little bit outside the downtown core to see a completely different reality. A reality that's reaching a breaking point. You know what I mean, right? We're not talking about just averted eyes or isolated sighs anymore. This April 2026, we're witnessing a wave that I'd call, well, for lack of a better term, the rise of street politics. Can you believe it? Massive protests, tent cities popping up right in the middle of public parks to defy those new ordinances. It's all putting some serious, heavy pressure on the government.
احنا بالنسبة لنا ضد الاحتلال، ضد إسرائيل، ضد أمريكا وضد رعاون أمريكا.
You know, in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, residents have been protesting continuously for more than 600 days. They blocked the streets and pushed barricades just because the city wants to build a temporary shelter for about 150 men who are struggling with housing.
At least talk to us and listen to our community, listen to our voice. But it's like we haven't been here. We have been here for over 600 days, and nobody is like, the new mayor never come here.
And just recently, on April 4th, in Richmond Valley on Staten Island, dozens of people gathered again, holding signs that said no services, no support, no sidewalks, then don't put this shelter here. What do you think? Is this just about not wanting it in my backyard, or is it a sign of a much bigger problem? Hundreds of people show up, waving American flags, holding protest signs, and blocking construction trucks. Shouts, echo, police have to step in, and some people even get hurt. Yeah, this isn't a Hollywood movie. It's actually happening right now in New York City, USA, in March and April 2026.
With homelessness, with young people not being able to afford anything in the city, with old people now being squeezed out of their little living space, the city doesn't seem to understand that these people have a mobility difficulty, cultural barriers. This is their area where they can move a little bit.
You got it? These protests didn't just happen by chance. They are the most vivid mirror reflecting how serious the homelessness crisis has become. But wait a second, why has the homelessness issue, which has been around for decades, mind you, suddenly become the hottest protest flashpoint right now? Is it just about not having a place to stay, or is there a much deeper battle for human rights going on behind the scenes? You got it? We're not just talking about a tent or a blanket here, we're talking about survival. You know, some people demand more affordable places to live, while others oppose support centers being opened near where they live. So, in the end, what exactly are those demonstrations saying about the current homelessness situation? And on the other hand, how do those very demonstrations affect this issue? What do you think? Here's the first hard truth. Most protests tied to homelessness are not really about the homeless as a label. They are about space, cost, control, and survival. And once you track them closely, three major protest types stand out. First, you have protests demanding housing access. These are the rallies pushing for cheaper rent, stronger tenant protections, more public housing, more vouchers, and faster placement into stable units. In plain English, this side is saying the system is failing long before someone ends up outside. From a survival standpoint, that argument is hard to dismiss. When rent eats half or more of a paycheck, when one missed shift or one medical bill knocks out the month, the margin is gone. Then, just like that, a car becomes a bedroom, a couch becomes a lifeline, and a shelter waitlist becomes the next stop. So, naturally, these protests frame homelessness as a housing pipeline problem, not a personal flaw.
Well, I'm here today because we have nobody to protect us. We have to be the protector of ourselves. Imagine we vote persons in to help us in situations like this, and we have no one now.
Then, on the other side, you get protests against shelters, temporary housing sites, or street encampments. This is where things get politically sharp, fast. Residents say they are worried about noise, sanitation, safety, foot traffic, and pressure on neighborhood services. City officials talk about emergency response. Business owners talk about lost customers. And honestly, on the ground, those concerns are not abstract. Sidewalk congestion, trash pickup strain is real. Public space tension is real. But here is where the argument gets brutally controversial. Many of these protests are sold as quality of life concerns, yet function as campaigns to push visible hardship somewhere else. When a city says it wants to fix homelessness, does it mean helping people live indoors or just making suffering less visible? That is the pressure point. Because once a shelter gets blocked, delayed, downsized, or buried in hearings, the street remains the fallback system. Finally, there are protests led by unhoused people themselves or by outreach groups, legal advocates, and mutual aid networks working beside them. These actions usually happen after sweeps, forced clearouts, storage seizures, or rules that cut people off from the few routines keeping them afloat.
The city is against us. The city is freezing us out, pushing us to the margins, and trying to equate the quality of life in New Haven with disappearing low-income people.
This is the most direct form of protest because it comes from people living the math every day. Where to sleep, where to charge a phone, where to keep documents dry, how far the bathroom is, how long a bus ride takes to a meal site, how many hours a shelter lets you stay inside, how quickly a missed check-in can cost you a bed. That is not theory. That is survival engineering under pressure. So when these groups protest, they are not usually speaking in polished slogans. They are pointing at operational failure. Not enough beds, not enough storage, not enough mental health support, not enough permanent housing, and way too much policy built around displacement instead of stability. So, taken together, these three protest types expose the full system. Pro-housing protests say the pipeline into homelessness is broken. Anti-shelter or anti-encampment protests show how communities often reject the very infrastructure needed to reduce street-level exposure. And protests led by unhoused people reveal the raw mechanics of how fragile daily survival really is. That is why this issue gets so heated so fast. It is not just a moral debate. It is a fight over land use, public tolerance, scarce resources, and who gets protected first when the city starts making choices. The raw numbers don't lie, and right now they're screaming. New York City's homelessness crisis isn't some distant policy debate. It's the direct fuel igniting these explosive protests in Bensonhurst and Staten Island, while the protests themselves are making the street-level nightmare even deadlier. Ever wonder why a working-class block don't blows into barricades and arrests? It's because the crisis has finally crashed into people's front doors with zero warning. On one side, the sheer scale of homelessness is driving these blow-ups hard. With more than 84,000 people packed into the shelter system every single night and a total crisis headcount pushing past 140,000, the city is forced to slam new facilities into neighborhoods fast. Drop a 150-bed men's shelter on 86th Street in Bensonhurst, right next to schools and senior centers, and locals don't see spreadsheets. They see the unfiltered street reality. Needles in the gutters, late-night fights, and the constant edge of chaos that comes when you concentrate untreated addiction and mental health cases without backup. Same story in Richmond Valley on Staten Island. Residents aren't abstractly anti-homeless, they're watching their daily life turn into a pressure release valve for the city's broken system. That's not NIMBY whining. That's a direct cause and effect reaction to a crisis that's already out of control. But here's the brutal flip side that hits even harder. Those same protests are actively making the homelessness problem worse. By blocking construction crews, chaining themselves to equipment, and dragging approvals through endless hearings, demonstrators delay shelters from ever opening. That means more bodies stay on the concrete, exposed to freezing nights, scorching days, and the non-stop fentanyl grind that's already stacking up overdoses like cordwood. Unsheltered counts creep higher, emergency calls spike, and the human cost piles up while the system grinds slower. And nobody wants to say it out loud, but these standoffs, no matter how justified they feel to locals, are actually keeping thousands trapped in the exact hell the shelters were built to fix. So you get this vicious, self-reinforcing loop. Bigger crisis demands faster shelter builds trigger, raw community, backlash stalls the builds, more people stay unsheltered, and the crisis gets even. Housing prices stay insane, mental health and addiction services stay underfunded, and the right to shelter law keeps forcing the city's hand with zero real community prep. It's not theory, it's the no bullshit street math playing out block by block, and right now both sides are losing. These protests are not just loud public arguments. They are stress tests that expose exactly where society starts to crack. At street level, the conflict is brutally simple. One group, is fighting for the basic right to stay alive with some level of stability, while another group is fighting to protect its sense of order, safety, and control over shared space. That clash is not theoretical. It plays out in feet of sidewalk, in the number of open shelter beds, in the distance to a public restroom, in how long someone can stay under a roof before getting pushed back outside. Here is the uncomfortable part. The same city that says every human life matters often turns hostile the second survival becomes visible on the block. And once that happens, protests stop being symbolic and start functioning like a live readout of civic pressure. First, there is the sharp conflict between the right to exist and the demand for public order. On one side, people say no one should be left without a safe place to sleep. On the other side, residents and business owners say sidewalks, parks, and transit zones cannot turn into unmanaged survival zones. Honestly, both sides are reacting to something real. Exposure on the street creates real strain. Noise, trash buildup, blocked access, health risks, and nonstop tension. At the same time, clearing people out without giving them a stable indoor option does not solve anything. It just resets the problem a few blocks away. So, in practice, the debate is not compassion versus rules. It is a hard fight over whose emergency gets prioritized first. And that is exactly why these protests get so emotionally charged so quickly. Next, there is the conflict between short-term control and long-term repair. This one matters a lot. Cities under pressure often lean toward immediate, visible action. Clear the encampment, move people along, add policing, tighten rules, reduce public complaints. It is fast, measurable, and politically useful. But long-term repair works differently. It takes more housing units, more case management, more mental health support, more rental relief, more storage, more transit access, and more patience than most city leaders are willing to spend. In other words, quick control changes what people see, long-term repair changes what people live through. And here's the question that cuts right through the noise. Are we funding solutions or are we funding appearances? Because once you follow the operational reality, the answer gets ugly fast. Then there is the conflict over responsibility, and this is where public opinion usually splits hard. A lot of people still frame homelessness as a personal failure, like bad choices alone explain the outcome. I do not buy that as the full story, not even close. On the ground, the numbers tell a harsher truth. Rent jumps faster than wages. One medical issue can wipe out savings. One missed paycheck can trigger eviction. And one broken support system can collapse everything else. So yes, personal decisions matter, but the system sets the blast radius. That is why protests become so divisive. One side wants accountability from individuals, the other wants accountability from institutions. And in real life, both pressures collide in the same space at the same time under the same city budget. Finally, these protests reveal a deeper contradiction that a lot of Americans feel but do not always say clearly. People want homelessness reduced, but they do not agree on what reducing it actually means. Some mean more shelters, more subsidized housing, more prevention, more wraparound help. Others mean fewer tents, fewer visible signs of instability, fewer disruptions near where they live. Those are not the same goal, and the difference is massive. One approach targets the root system, the other targets the surface. So, Taken together, these protests expose a society arguing with itself in public about dignity, property, safety, money, and who gets to belong in urban space when resources run thin. That is why the conflict feels so raw. It is not just about homelessness. It is about the rules of survival in a city that is already under strain. Viewed as a whole, protests related to homelessness carry both positive aspects and clear limitations. First of all, their biggest positive effect is that they keep this issue from being treated as merely an urban blind spot and turn it into a public matter that society is forced to confront. When crowds speak out, the media pays closer attention, authorities come under greater pressure, and questions about housing, welfare, social safety nets, and governance responsibility are raised far more sharply. In that sense, protests can become a driving force for policy change, from rental assistance and the expansion of temporary shelter spaces to investment in long-term housing solutions. However, protests also have an obvious negative side. In many cases, they expose deep divisions among different interest groups in society. One side emphasizes the right to live safely and have stable housing, while the other stresses public order, sanitation, and neighborhood security. This very confrontation can sometimes slow down practical solutions, especially when projects intended to support homeless people, such as shelters or transitional housing, run into strong opposition from local communities. In other words, protests are necessary, but the direction they take will determine whether they help address the problem or simply make the conflict more intense. From that, it can be affirmed that homelessness and protests have a close relationship and affect each other in both directions. To solve the problem at its root, society cannot deal only with the surface level, but needs sustainable housing policies, efforts to reduce inequality, and a reasonable balance between community interests and the right to live of people in vulnerable situations. Ultimately, this is not only an economic issue or a matter of urban management, but also a very clear measure of a society's fairness and humanity.